Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. Today I want to talk about a really good question that I got from a friend of mine, Christine, over on Instagram. So I shared a gallery because I've been doing a lot of like smaller, like micro weddings. I think that's the word. I've been doing micro weddings, just because of like everything that's going on in the world. And I shared a gallery of some of the images that I got. And I was working alone, did not have a lot of time to get portraits, working on a time crunch as a lot of us photographers do. And she asked this question, and I thought it was a really good question and a great video idea. And basically she's saying, how do you get the variety in an album, like at the final gallery? When you're working by yourself, you don't have a lot of time and you're really thinking about the poses, but you need to also be thinking about the composition and the focal length and that kind of thing. So getting a good variety when you're shooting by yourself while you're thinking about a million other things. And I love this question because I think that's something that we all struggle with when we're trying to think about poses, trying to make sure we're maintaining a good connection with our couples, but also thinking about the timeline and the lighting and our camera settings and keeping ourselves from getting lost in, the day, right? So it can get pretty crazy. And then by the time portraits are over, we can sometimes be kicking ourselves because we forgot to try this one pose, or we forgot to, have them turn, and actually look at us for some pictures and stuff like that. And so what I'd like to do is kind of walk you through my approach to posing and getting a good variety, especially when you only have 10 minutes to work with a couple and you're by yourself and you can't rely on getting a second photographer's second perspective, and how I get that variety and what I'm thinking about while I'm posing and directing and choosing my compositions. And so this is going to be short, but I think it's going to be really helpful to some of you who might be trying to shake things up a little bit when it comes to just more variation within your galleries. So the first thing I will say is that I shoot on 2 camera bodies, and I do this to get more variety and focal length options just kind of built in throughout the day. Because if I shoot on 1 camera body, I am going to have to switch lenses more often, and that takes time, but that also increases the risk of dust or debris or something like that entering into my camera body or getting on the contacts of the lens. And so I really don't want to be changing my lenses dozens of times throughout the day. And because of that, I started shooting on 2 camera bodies pretty early in my career, and so I'm very used to that. So I will say that that adds a lot of variety to my final galleries, because I can just really quickly flip back and forth between these cameras, getting totally different perspectives, compositions, and focal lengths because they're different lenses. And so what I will say is, if you only have 1 camera body or you don't want to wear that much gear, I totally get that because it is very heavy. What I would recommend though is that you carry on your body a lens or 2 that you can switch to pretty quickly. I like the Shoot Sack camera bag for that reason, and that's what I used when I only shot on 1 camera body, so that I could switch out quickly. But that's going to help you to get more variety, is really be thinking about your lenses and consider using 2 camera bodies. Then of course, if you're shooting with 2 camera bodies like I am, you have to be thinking really critically about what lenses you're choosing to put on those camera bodies. And so I like to make sure that the lenses are pretty different. I'm not going to put, a 60 millimeter and a 50 millimeter because that's pretty similar, or a 35 and a 28. What I like to do is have maybe an 85 millimeter and a 35 millimeter, or the 58 millimeter and the 35 millimeter, because they have such different results. And so regardless of whether you're shooting on 2 camera bodies or 1, make sure that as you're switching out your lenses, you choose a different enough lens to get an entirely different look from when you're doing portraits. So I find that if I have the 35 millimeter and the 85 millimeter and I'm shooting a couple, let's say, on a wedding day, I probably won't need to switch that lens ever, because I can get such different results from those 2 different lenses, and you can get so much variety. So that's kind of the first thing, is really thinking critically about what lenses you're choosing when you're trying to get more variety. Now, the next thing I will say is that when I'm posing my couples, I like to start out with like a classic pose. So I'm not gonna shoot super wide, I'm not gonna shoot super tight. I'm gonna start with a full length shot of my couple. So let's say that I start out with them facing one another. And so I'll put a picture here as an example for you guys. So they're facing one another, I have a full length shot. The next thing that I wanna do, and this is kind of just by force of habit and years of experience, but for me, my next step is always wide and then tight. So I shoot like middle, I get that like classic shot, and then I get a little bit wider, get a little bit tighter. And that is without changing their pose at all. So that's something that's like, I think sometimes photographers think, you know, in order to get a huge amount of variety and keep the gallery really fresh and amazing, I have to constantly be thinking of new poses and changing them and reinventing the wheel. When really you can get a tremendous amount of variety without them changing their pose. So you'll see there's a full length shot, and then the couple didn't move at all, but I moved and I switched cameras, and the tighter portrait is entirely different. And so what I want to urge you is that sometimes this is a matter of us moving, changing perspectives, and changing our lenses instead of changing the pose. So I think that sometimes it's just a matter of really exhausting the pose that's working before you try to change it, because it can be exhausting to try to think of new poses all the time, right? Like to feel like your posing is getting a little bit stale. And I think staying fresh on your posing, trying new things, that's all wonderful. But what can really help to freshen your work can really be you moving instead of the couple moving. So the next thing that I'll do, besides choosing my lenses really carefully, shooting medium, wide, and then tight, is I will have my couple make micro pose changes. And so you can get so much variety just by having them change small things. So for example, if I have a time where I'm posing a couple and they're maybe nose to nose or forehead to forehead, if I like compositionally when I look at the back of my camera how things are looking, I will go ahead and have them look at me and completely change the pose, but with micro changes. And so instead of having them move to a new location or try to completely reposition them, because it can take time for a couple to kind of melt into a pose, once they've gotten into that pose, I will let them know, hey, I love everything about this. Without changing your pose, can you guys look at me? And so I'm constantly doing that, where if I like the position of a hand, but I want to change the pose a little bit, I'll have the bride move her head, or I'll have the groom reach up and hold the bride's face. So micro changes can be so powerful, because just a hand position or a head position, or bringing heads together, or even having them look at you and smile, completely different photograph than having them looking at each other or be forehead to forehead. And so I think some of the variety that is seen in the gallery that I shared at the beginning is because it's micro changes. And so I think between these 3 tips, hopefully you guys will be able to get a little bit more variation and shake up your posing just a little bit without having to reinvent, and learn 5 new poses, but rather make micro changes that have huge results. So this has been my 3 go-to tips. The first is choose your lenses carefully and use 2 camera bodies if you can. The second is shoot medium, wide, and then tight, or really whatever order makes sense in your mind that's easy for you to replicate when you're under pressure, when there's a lot going on, to just remind yourself you could start wide, medium, and tight if that makes sense to you. But just to repeat that pattern is gonna make so much variation in your gallery. And then number 3, ask your couple to make micro adjustments instead of feeling like you need to, move them and pose them in new ways every single time. Have them make micro adjustments, and then you walk around them and fully exhaust that pose before moving on to a new one. I hope these tips have been helpful for you guys. If they have, please consider subscribing and hit that thumbs up button. Thank you so much for watching. As usual, I will see you next week. Bye guys.